Well, welcome back. We're glad you're able to join us as we look at Chapter 4 of James in our continuing study from the Smith and Helway's Formation series. In this week, we're going to be talking in Chapter 4, the topic of the lesson is faithful conflict. And we're going to be talking, Christie, about conflict this week. Looking at verse 1, James opens right up by saying, those conflicts and disputes among you, where do they come from? And boy, that's a question that we find ourselves asking often. And James answers the question for us. He says, do they not come from your cravings that are at war within you? You want something, you don't have it, so what do? You commit murder. Boy, that's kind of convicting. I'm not sure that I've ever murdered anybody over it, but, you know, sometimes when he uses that word, he's using it in a way that we really do understand. He goes on to say, and you covet something that you can't obtain, so you engage in disputes and conflicts. Boy, I tell you, as you read that, there's so many applications in our life, Christy, where, you know, we just see that selfish side of us. And so often when we find ourselves in a conflict with our neighbor, you know, if we'll really be honest about it and look at what really causes that, there's a whole lot of selfishness and a whole lot of I in there. That's what I see.
I agree with you, Joe. And the second part of verse 2, it says, you do not have because you do not ask. And oftentimes that's a misquoted or misunderstood verse because people forget to go ahead and read on with, you ask and do not receive because you ask wrongly in order to spend what you get on your pleasures. So we're really talking about here and moving into the conflict that we have with God. And you start to see in verse 4, James says, adulterers, do you not know that your friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world becomes an enemy of God. So we're talking about the fact that we allow the worldly things, or like last week when we talked about the earthly wisdom, we allow things from the earth and from the world to totally enter our lives, and we don't maintain that friendship with God. And oftentimes when we don't ask, we don't get it. And when we do ask, we're not asking in the right way. And it goes back to what you said earlier about our egos are big. We are selfish people, and we don't like to admit it, but we are. So what do you see now that we've identified we have conflict with man, we have conflict with God, and we think that those things are negative, but I can't help but to think there are times when conflict is good, and it can lead to good things. And James goes on to share some things with us in the remaining verses of this passage that talk about how we can achieve the best version of ourselves. So why don't you take that away, Joe?
Well, I agree, Christy, and I think one of the things that we need to look at there, right at the end of verse 6, he says, God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And I think that's such an important concept because, you know, as long as we operate out of selfish pride and arrogance, and, you know, we're so satisfied with what we accomplish, you know, I think it's very difficult for God's grace to be a part of us. In other words, it's hard to accept God's grace when we're pointing our finger at ourselves. I mean, our hands need to be out to God, humbly asking for Him to do a work within us. And so I think that's such an important part of this. But to get into what James talks about, there's a number of things he says, starting with the first one in verse 7, which is, submit yourselves, therefore, to God. I can think of nothing that is a better example of being humble than to have it as a best practice to run everything by God. You know, kind of like you would run it by your spouse, or maybe like you would run it by your boss at work. I mean, think about it. What I think about when I see submit yourselves therefore to God is run everything you do by God. How much better would life be for us if we just ran everything by God? If we said, hey, God, will this honor you? Hey, God, will this be something that will If I do this, will this glorify you? Will this make me a good witness? So, yeah, I think for starters, we need to be submissive to God and run everything past Him.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great. He also mentions resisting the devil and how we go about doing that. And I think it relates back to this whole submit. If we haven't fully submitted to God, it's going to be hard to resist the devil. And when we're friends with the world or the worldly ways, it's even harder to resist the devil. And I think we really do have to put a lot of trust in the Lord, and we have to do things such as have that prayer time, be in the fellowship of other Christians, and we have to look at ourselves constantly and say, is what I'm doing going to bring favor to God? And we have to do those little self-checks and making sure that when we're being tempted and we're having a hard time resisting, we've got to ask ourselves, is this going to be favorable in the eyes of the Lord? But we have to do that, and it's hard.
I like that next one where he says, draw near to God and He will draw near to you. This whole idea of drawing near or being drawn, that's the way I think about it. It almost kind of indicates that God has got like this force, magnetic force, where He's almost saying, let go. We're clinging to the post, trying not to get sucked into God, because that's really our natural place. God created us such that our natural place was we would be drawn into Him. And what we do is we cling to the worldly things that are like the things that keep us from being drawn up into that current into God. But the idea of drawing near to God, He'll draw near to you. You know, again, we talk about this in this study, but our earlier example from the Experiencing God study earlier this year, we learned that really God doesn't want us to do anything for Him. God just wants us to be in relationship with Him. He just wants us to draw near to Him. So doing that is one of the ways that, you know, we're able to deal with conflict in our life is if we'll just, you know, conflict draws us away from God. We need to be drawn into God.
Mm-hmm. I agree. And then one of the other ones, Joe, that I like about cleansing your hands and purifying your hearts. Think of all the different examples in the Bible where that becomes sort of an expectation. It's sort of a practice, a protocol. Cleanse your hands. Make sure that the sacrifices were all clean and pure. But for me, cleansing hands and purifying my heart means sort of getting all of that worldly dirt off of my hands and just focusing on the things that I need to be focused on, and not being double-minded, and making sure that what comes out of my mouth is pleasant to the Lord. And not so much that the cleansing piece be so much of a process as much as it is a time of reflection for me. And what's in my heart. You know, last week we talked about our speech, how that was a reflection of what was in our heart. I have to constantly work on purifying my heart. It's a process. It's like putting a filter on your faucet to get pure water out. You don't just take that purifier off your faucet when you finish. You leave it on there so that you're ready for the next glass of water. And the same thing should happen to me in my heart. It's a constant process of is what's coming in and what's going out reflective of God.
Yeah, absolutely. Verse 9, lament and mourn and weep. Let your laughter be turned into mourning and your joy into dejection. I got to tell you, Christy, when I read this verse, I did a double take. I said, wait a minute.
Sure.
I mean, I thought the Christian life was all about being happy and excited and having laughter. And, you know, he's saying, hey, you need to be in mourning and and dejected. And I thought, what in the world is he talking about here? But as I thought about this, he's saying that one of the keys to resolving conflict is we have to get so disgusted with ourselves. We have to take such responsibility for our part in a conflict, whether it's with God or with our neighbor. We have to just take responsibility. And in my life, when I've had conflict with people, generally it's ended up in one of two attitudes that I walk away with. Number one, I'm mad. I feel like I've been taken advantage of. I think it's all their fault, and I'm not going to talk to them again. I'm just not going to be happy. And that never really works good. The other approach is when I reflect on what just happened, and I reflect on the fact that I too had a part in that conflict, and I begin to realize that I'm ashamed of my part in that, and my heart gets heavy, and I go back and ask for their grace and forgiveness for my part, and with no thought of them asking for me for grace and forgiveness on their part. But just truly, I am just so disgusted that I did that. I think that's what he's talking about. You have to get that humbled in order to be able to really, as you say, achieve the best version of yourself because of the conflict. Right.
And in verse 10, it talks about, finally, humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will exalt you. The last shall become first, and throughout the Bible, it talks about the humbleness and the humility that people should have, and that he will continue to provide grace to those who do that. And, we're so pumped up with ego and selfishness sometimes. It's hard for us to reach that level of humbleness and to actually admit, you know what, I wronged you, therefore I am so sorry. And that takes a lot for us to be able to do that. And, back to that whole friendship with the world and the conflict with the world, the conflict here is that our society doesn't always value people who are humble, and they practice humility because that tends to be a sign of weakness, whereas here from the scripture, that is an attribute that we want to have, and that can actually help us resolve these conflicts with our neighbors or the conflicts that we're having with God when we recognize what our part is in the conflict. And 9 times out of 10, if not 100% of the time, we own it, and we have to take responsibility, and that's hard for us to do because it's so much easier to point the finger and place blame somewhere else.
Well, Christy, the central question this week was, how can I live out my faith in the midst of conflict? And, we talk about living out our faith. He doesn't say, how do we avoid conflict? I mean, it's kind of interesting that the writers of the lesson didn't say, how do we avoid conflict? And hopefully we haven't approached it that way either. I think the way we've approached this lesson today is conflict's going to happen because we're selfish people at our core. And conflict happens with our neighbors and it happens with God. But really recognizing that conflict can actually be a way that leads us forward, that helps us become a better version of ourselves. That's what we hope that I know for you and I, we hope that we take that away from this, but also for all of you who are watching this, we hope that that's, maybe the takeaway. Any final thoughts?
I think that's it. I just want people to remember that not all conflict is bad. It can be good, and it can lead us into a different direction, one that's positive. And like we both picked out one of our favorite verses here. It can draw us nearer to God, and that's the
Well, listen, we appreciate you being here with us this week. Next week we're going to be in the 5th chapter of James, the rich and the poor. What does my attitude towards wealth say about my faith? So we hope you'll come back and join Christy and I again next week for our 5th and final lesson from the Smith and Hellway session on James. Until then, have a great week. God bless you. We'll see you again next time.